The late afternoon sun sank low behind the jagged mesas of New Mexico territory, casting long shadows over the dusty, worn-out town of Dry Creek. The wooden buildings, battered by years of relentless wind and scorching sun, stood silent except for the creak of the saloon's swinging doors and the occasional clatter of horseshoes on hard-packed dirt. Jake Callahan wiped the sweat from his brow as he led his horse, Scout, down the main street. He'd been riding since dawn, chasing a herd that had scattered somewhere near the eastern ridge. His boots thudded heavily on the boardwalk as he passed the general store, nodding to the few folks going about their business. Jake was a man carved out of the frontier itself, tall, rugged, with a jaw that looked like it'd been shaped by a dozen fistfights and eyes that held the steady calm of a man who knew how to survive. He was no stranger to loneliness, having spent the last 3 years drifting between ranches, never quite settling. Tonight, however, the wind had shifted and so had his luck. Dark clouds rolled in fast, thick and heavy, swallowing the horizon. The air dropped in temperature, carrying the unmistakable scent of a coming storm. Jake spurred Scout into a faster trot, seeking shelter before the rain turned into a freezing downpour. Just as the first drops fell, a sharp cry cut through the wind. Jake's eyes caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of town. Close to the old Miller barn, a woman, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, struggling against the sudden cold. Without hesitation, Jake swung down from Scout and strode toward her. "Ma'am, you best come with me. That storm's gonna make this place a hell of a lot colder." She looked up, eyes wide and tired. I don't have anywhere to go." Jake's heart clenched at the raw desperation in her voice. Out here, mercy was scarce, but tonight, something in him stirred. "There's a cabin just past the creek. It ain't much, but it'll keep you out of the storm." The woman nodded, stepping closer as the rain began to fall in earnest. Together, they hurried through the gathering darkness toward the cabin. The cabin was small and rough-hewn, built from logs felled decades ago. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a welcome shield against the biting cold. Jake set about stoking the flames while the woman settled near the window, watching the storm rage outside. "Name's Sarah," she said quietly, almost hesitant to speak. "Jake," he replied, offering a slight smile. For hours, the wind howled, but inside, there was only the quiet crackling of fire and the steady beat of 2 heartbeats, learning to share the same space. What neither of them knew was that by sharing that night of shelter, they had also unknowingly entered into a bond older than the land itself. A sacred law whispered among the first people of these territories, binding to souls who find refuge together in the harshest of storms. When dawn finally broke over the mesas, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling under a pale blue sky. But for Jake and Sarah, everything had changed forever. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the small cabin's window, painting the worn wooden walls with a pale golden hue. Jake sat on a rough-hewn stool, staring into the dwindling embers of last night's fire. The storm had passed, but the weight of the night lingered heavy in the quiet room. Sarah stirred on the cot across from him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night's chill still clung to her bones, but her eyes held a new strength, a flicker of hope Jake hadn't expected to see when he first found her trembling outside the barn. "Morning," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but steady. Sarah looked up, offering a small smile. "Morning, Jake." Neither spoke of the storm or the night before, the kind of things that felt too large, too strange to explain in mere words. Instead, they sat quietly, letting the sun chase away the last shadows of fear and cold. After a moment, Sarah finally spoke. "You saved me last night. I don't know how to thank you." Jake shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but there was a softness in his eyes. "Out here, we look out for one another, especially when the world's trying to break us down." Her gaze held his for a beat longer, and Jake felt a strange warmth rise in his chest. Something unspoken passed between them, a connection deeper than either could explain. It was then that a sharp knock rattled the cabin door, startling them both. Jake rose cautiously and opened the door to find a man standing in the dust and sunlight, his face weathered and serious. He tipped his hat. "Morning, Jake. I hear you had a visitor last night." Jake nodded slowly. "Didn't expect company?" The man's eyes flicked toward Sarah, who now stood behind Jake, clutching her shawl tighter. "Name's Thomas. I'm the town marshal." Jake frowned. "Marshal? What's this about?" Thomas's gaze was steady, almost wary. "There's talk around town about the old laws, the sacred law. Folks say it's more than just a legend." Sarah's breath hitched slightly, and Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sacred law." Thomas nodded. Out here, there are old ways, ancient rules tied to this land and its first people. One says if two strangers share shelter in a storm, they're bound by law. Not just law in the court sense, but by spirit. Jake blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. Spirit law. Sounds like folk tales. Maybe, Thomas said, but the stories have teeth. They say once the bond's made, those two are mates linked for life, whether they want it or not. Sarah's eyes searched Jake's, fear and hope tangled together. I've heard it too, she whispered. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of the strange truth settling over them. Last night's shelter wasn't just kindness. It was a binding neither had known they were walking into. The wind outside whispered through the trees, carrying with it a promise and a warning. Their lives were about to change in ways neither could have imagined. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on the small cabin and the dusty land beyond. Jake paced the creaking floorboards, his thoughts a tangle of confusion and doubt. The words Thomas had spoken still echoed in his mind, bound by the sacred law. Sarah sat quietly by the window, watching the world come alive after the storm. Her fingers twisted nervously in her shawl, and when Jake looked her way, he saw the weight she carried, the fear of what this bond meant for them both. So what now? Jake asked, his voice rough from days on the trail and sleepless nights. Are we supposed to just accept this, that some old law binds us together? Sarah turned, eyes steady but soft. I don't know, but I do know one thing. If the law says we're mates, then maybe there's a reason for it, something bigger than either of us. Jake grunted, running a hand over his face. He'd never been one for superstition or old legends. Out here, survival was about grit, not ghost stories, but this felt real, like a noose slowly tightening around his heart. The town of Dry Creek was small, but word traveled fast. By noon, whispers had begun to spread, strangers sharing shelter in a storm, bound by the sacred law. Some townsfolk looked at Sarah with suspicion, others with curiosity. Jake noticed the subtle change in how people greeted him, the cautious eyes that lingered a moment too long. That evening, the marshal returned, this time with an older woman who carried herself with the quiet authority of one who had seen many storms and lived to tell the tale. This is Clara, Thomas introduced. She knows the old ways, the sacred law. If anyone can help us understand this bond, it's her. Clara's eyes were sharp, filled with both wisdom and sorrow. The sacred law is ancient, rooted in respect and balance. When two souls share shelter in the storm, they're linked, their fates intertwined like the roots of the mesquite tree. Jake frowned. And what if one of us doesn't want this? Clara's gaze softened. The bond isn't about choice. It's about necessity. It protects, it binds, and it commands loyalty. But it also demands truth, honesty between the mates. Sarah stepped forward, voice trembling but determined. I don't want to be bound to anyone I don't trust. Jake's eyes met hers, and in that moment, something shifted. The fear, the doubt, it gave way to a fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, this bond was a chance for something neither had dared to find before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Dry Creek, Jake and Sarah sat side by side on the cabin's porch. The law had bound them, yes, but now it was up to them to decide what that bond would mean. The morning air was crisp, sharp with the scent of pine and earth. Dry Creek was waking slow, the usual bustle of cattle drives and wagon wheels muted under the weight of an uneasy silence. Jake sat on the porch, polishing his worn revolver, his thoughts heavy with the promise and burden of the bond that tied him to Sarah. Sarah stood nearby, mending a torn sleeve on her worn dress. She glanced at Jake now and then, searching for some sign of what lay beneath his steady exterior. Neither of them spoke much. The words were still too new, too raw to break the fragile calm. You're thinking about leaving? Sarah finally said, voice low but steady. Jake didn't look up. Maybe I should. I've been drifting for years. Maybe this bond, it's just another chain. Sarah's eyes darkened with a quiet fire. You think I want to be tied to a stranger? To someone I barely know? Jake finally met her gaze. No. I'm saying maybe it's too soon to know what this means. They sat in silence, the wind whispering secrets through the dry grass. Outside the cabin, the town's wary eyes kept watch, but inside, two souls were wrestling with the hardest frontier of all, the heart. Days passed with the slow rhythm of the land. Jake helped repair fences. Sarah tended to the small garden by the cabin, and together they learned the unspoken language of shared space, a glance, a sigh, a touch that lingered just a moment too long. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, Jake found Sarah sitting by the fire pit, staring into the flames. He sat beside her. The silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. "I don't know if I believe in this sacred law," Jake admitted, his voice rough with honesty, "but I know I don't want to lose what we have, whatever it is." Sarah smiled, a soft, real smile that warmed the chill in the air. "Maybe that's what the law means, not that we're forced together, but that we have to choose each other, every day." Their hands brushed, hesitant but certain, and for the first time, the bond between them felt less like a chain and more like a promise. But the frontier was never kind to promises. The days grew hotter, and the wind carried a dry grit that coated everything from wagon wheels to the backs of necks. Life in Dry Creek held its usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, something restless stirred. Jake had grown used to waking beside Sarah, the once foreign presence, now a steady comfort. Their bond, once a mystery, was slowly shaping into a quiet understanding. But the peace was fragile. A whisper away from breaking. Trouble came riding in on a cloud of dust and bad intentions. A group of men, strangers to Dry Creek but known in nearby towns for troublemaking, rolled into town one afternoon. Their leader, a hard-eyed man named Harlan Pike, eyed the townsfolk like a wolf sizing up prey. Rumors swirled quickly, cattle rustling, debts owed, and grudges older than the canyon walls. Jake recognized the threat immediately. These men weren't just passing through. They came with a purpose, and Dry Creek wasn't ready. Sarah watched from the cabin window, tension tightening her shoulders. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Jake's jaw clenched. "We protect what's ours, and that includes you." That night, voices carried on the wind, low and threatening, echoing down the empty streets. Jake stood at the edge of town, hand hovering near his revolver, eyes scanning the shadows. Sarah joined him, determination flashing in her gaze. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. He looked at her, the weight of their bond settling heavier than ever. "We're in this together." As the strangers made their move, tearing fences, spooking horses, testing the town's grit, Jake and Sarah found themselves not just defending their land, but the fragile trust they'd built. When dawn broke over Dry Creek, smoke still curled from a few scorched patches of earth, but Jake and Sarah stood side by side, stronger than the storm. Bound by something more than law, by choice. The heat of midday pressed down on Dry Creek like a heavy weight. Dust hung thick in the air, clinging to every surface. The scars of last night's attack were still fresh. Broken fences, trampled fields, and the distant, uneasy silence of a town holding its breath. Jake stood atop the ridge overlooking the valley, scalp pawing nervously beneath him. His eyes narrowed on the distant line of dust where Harlan Pike and his men had vanished, no doubt regrouping for another strike. Sarah approached quietly, her boots crunching over dry brush. "They won't give up easily," she said, voice steady but laced with worry. Jake turned to her, a flicker of something softer passing through his rugged features. "Neither will we." For all the hardships they'd faced, the storm, the sacred law, the threat of outsiders, this was the moment that would define them. The law that bound them wasn't just ancient legend, it was the promise of standing together when the world tried to tear them apart. That evening, under a sky bleeding red and purple, they met with the townsfolk in the saloon. Eyes wary but hopeful, turned toward Jake and Sarah. The pair had somehow become the heart of Dry Creek's fight. "We're not just neighbors now," Jake said, voice steady. "We're family, and no one's gonna run us off this land." Sarah reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. It was more than a symbol, it was a seal forged by fire and choice, a bond that neither law nor outlaw could break. As the last light faded, the two stood outside the saloon, ready to face whatever came next. The sacred law had brought them together, but it was their courage and love that would see them through. The dawn crept slowly over Dry Creek, casting soft light on a town battered but unbroken. The threat of Harlan Pike and his men had faded with the night, chased away by a town united and two souls forged in fire. Jake stood on the porch of the cabin, the morning breeze cool against his weathered face. Beside him, Sarah tended a small patch of wildflowers she'd planted, a quiet rebellion against the harsh land that had once seemed so unforgiving. The sacred law that had bound them in the storm was no longer a chain, but a bridge. It was a beginning, not an end. "Feels different," Sarah said softly, her eyes meeting Jake's. "How so?" he asked. "We chose this," she said, "not because of old laws or fate, but because we want to." Jake smiled, a slow, genuine curve of his lips. "I reckon that's the best kind of bond." They stood together, watching the sun climb higher, lighting the way for the days to come. Whatever storms might roll in, whatever trials the frontier held, They would face them side by side, bound by love, by choice, and by the land they called home. The past had shaped them. The law had found them, but their future, that was theirs alone.